Good afternoon and welcome back to the Economy and Future of Work stage at CogX. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce for you a panel to talk about the future of work reimagined. Obviously, today's conference is going to have really interesting ideas that you may well want to tweet about. So I suggest that you consider tweeting anything that you see or hear today at CogX 2020, and also consider tweeting about our partner institution on this stage, which is the Institute for the Future of Work @_IFOW. Slido will also be used for any questions that you want to throw out to the panelists over the course of the event. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Clare Barclay, CEO at Microsoft, in order to introduce our panelists and the event. Thank you.
Thank you. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here today. And I was delighted to be invited to the Economy and Future of Work track. We have an exciting session for you this afternoon. And I think if you think of the context that we're operating in, it really is incredibly unprecedented times, perhaps an overused word. But I think as leaders, we're wrestling with significant change. You've got the impact of the global crisis, dealing with the challenges of the societal issues that we've seen in recent weeks of inclusion and racism. And then if you cast forward to what the impact of Brexit's going to be, there's never been a more challenging time for leaders to think about how they're going to shape this and wrestle with the challenges that they're being faced with. So I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you about some of the most important themes, and I have some great speakers to be able to do that with. So the talk today is going to anchor around three key topics. The first will be leadership and how we're preparing for a different future. The second will be, in a market that's changing so rapidly, what does it mean to be competitive, whether you're working in a large commercial organization, leading a government or working in government, or you're a fast-paced entrepreneur? What is it going to do to create opportunities, take decisions to thrive for the future? And then what are we all going to do as leaders to create the future? In the theme of CogX and getting the next 10 years right, what is the shape of the return to work going to be? How will work shape out? How does culture play within that? And then the important topic of skills for the future and what future economic worth and jobs will look like. So as I thought about these three topics, I wanted to have speakers as part of this session that have inspired me in each of these areas. So it's a great pleasure to introduce today's guest speakers. Dr. Chris Brauer from Goldsmiths University of London, and Osvald, Bjelland, founder and CEO of Xynteo. So please, a very big welcome. So hopefully I can, yes, welcome to both of you. Really lovely to have you both here with me. So before we get into the meat of this discussion, can I invite you both to introduce yourselves and perhaps say a few opening words on what you believe the future of work will look like? And maybe I'll start with you, Oswald, too.
Thank you very much, Claire. I'm delighted to be with you both and to participate in this session. I'm the CEO of Xynteo, an advisory firm, and we work with global companies to reinvent growth. And we have learned that the gateway to achieve the transformation we need are leaders who are willing and able to transform themselves, their organizations, and the wider system. When it comes to the future of work, I think we have seen an enormous change only in the last few months. A little while ago, the future of work came down to a discussion around digital. After COVID, I think that we have seen a new situation altogether, and we are now talking about the revolution of work. What does this new situation mean for government, companies, and workers? And in many ways, the revolution of work is the new defining question for our societies, in our opinion, for companies and the workers in our world, and not least in the UK, which is such an open and competitive economy. Yeah. I look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the opening words. And I mean, Dr. Chris, this is a topic definitely that is near and dear to your heart, one that you both practice in leading and also study as an academic. So, I mean, what can you start with the introduction of yourself and then your perspective on future of work?
Yeah, thanks, Claire. I'm Director of Innovation at Goldsmiths at the University of London, and I'm also one of 50 global strategy officers in industry with the World Economic Forum. And in those roles, we're working on the front lines of thousands of organizations in the UK and globally as they experience this kind of intersection of human behavior and smart and emerging technologies colliding. And they, in the process, are reshaping, refreshing, reconfiguring, recycling their workforce and their working practices. And I really like the title of this session around the notion of reimagining the future of work, because, you know, echoing what Osvald's been saying there, you know, this is a kind of a perfect storm, a conflation of many different cultural and contextual factors in the environments in which organizations are operating that has led to a kind of a rupture in the fabric of time of work. And we have a kind of a jumping off point now as the economy seeks to reemerge, but also as communities and collectively around the globe, we seek to come together to understand the notion of work. And it's going to be in some ways connected to our history of work, but it's also going to ask new questions that have only passing relevance to those old models. And to that end, this period of renewal is just a tremendously exciting time to be exploring this notion of what work can and should look like.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, some of the history of work and the future of work, I think you're going to have cultural shadows and behaviors where people are used to things and then things are going to be very different. And I think that topic of like culture and transformation is something I think we'll come back to during this discussion. So if I start in on the first topic of leadership, probably at the cornerstone of many of the people listening in, whatever type of business, commercial or public, small or large. And Osvald, I'll start with you. I mean, you spend a great deal of time in the business you do day to day, in every industry, including governments. In your opinion, what does strong leadership look like, both in the current climate and as we evolve from this?
So I think there are certain questions which are timeless in the world of leadership, and some questions come and go. One of the core essential characteristics of great leaders is, of course, to understand how the world is changing and to figure out how do you focus your resources to what yields the highest return. And in the current situation, we have seen some very good leadership and some very weak leadership. We see at this point in time greater division and tension. But leadership is about uniting and collaboration. It is not about escalating or dividing people. And what I see in the strong leaders today is an unprecedented empathy, like a care for the people you serve, the customers, the stakeholders. See that actually the digital revolution or the virtual work has offered us an opportunity to pick up the tempo and pace and flexibility. The question we have to ask ourselves at this time, very special time, is, I wonder, how can we achieve, while everything is not going well, we are very challenged, how can we achieve accelerated learning between governments and between businesses and across society? I think, for example, Clare, that here in Norway we have seen a good example where our Prime Minister was able to lead us through the COVID crisis rapidly, and we have really got our hands around that trouble. If you look at some companies like the CEO of Scania, the CEO of Yara, Alan Job in Unilever, are example of leaders who have really addressed with deep insight what is called for at this time to drive value for their organizations, but also to be helpful to a broader stakeholder community.
Yeah, many of those leaders, I think their employees and stakeholders, they do feel connected and very listened to some of the leaders. And I think that focus of empathy and deep listening and understanding is at the core of some of that strength I think they've portrayed. Dr. Chris, I think, you know, you and I have worked together on kind of what shapes leadership, what shapes transformation. What do you believe leadership and the shape of the future of work will have when you think of some of the comments that Osvald made reference to?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, leadership, luckily in many ways is something that has been studied extremely thoroughly, and we have a lot of insights into the origin of leadership traits and what makes good leaders, what makes great leaders. Interestingly, lots of twin studies have been conducted, and in those we can see clearly that about genes or genetics account for about 50% of the variance in leadership styles, and the other 50% can be developed. And so it's a classic kind of bridge between nature and nurture in terms of what makes leaders and how they can develop their traits. That 50% that can be developed in anyone. And I think one thing we're seeing around the future of work is to Osvald's point, we see a kind of a democratization, a bigger tent in which people are expressing and empowering their workforces to bring their values and to engage with the work that they're doing. And so we're saying, don't train and recruit a small group of individuals as leaders, as it were, within your organization, or limit yourself through your selection instruments to identifying leaders. That could lead to potentially a gross underutilization of what is coming, which is in dynamic workforces, we're seeing leadership at every level of the organization, and not everyone can be a great leader, but we can work to develop the leadership characteristics and traits in everyone. And that can lead to much more empowered workforce and engaged indeed with the overall mission and purpose of the organization. And the only other thing I would speak to is the indifference concept, which is the biggest threat, I would guess, to leadership in the future. We have a generation of leaders who've been brought up in a kind of stoic mindset, a philosophical mindset that has valued the traits of resilience and grit and determination, mindsets that relate to an ability and ability to deal with success and failure, treat each imposter as the same, and continue to develop and evolve and change. And that's very positive, but it's also been born from an idea that, control and change the things you can and accept the things that you cannot change. And in the broader landscape, leaders are no longer really in a position to do that any longer. We're seeing that whether, as you mentioned, it's the institutional racism or COVID or climate change or any of the big factors that are influencing, that is now something that leaders need to be taking strong positions on and engaging with the world around them as much as they engage with what's going on within their organizations.
Yeah, and then I think that to that point is they've got to listen, think about how they're going to change personally, and actually know that sometimes that the things that they've learned in the past is not the things that are going to make them successful and in tune with employees and society of the future. I'm going to I've just looked at some of the questions that are coming in, so I'm going to maybe go to one of those. A question from the audience. I'll come to you, Osvald. Do you believe we will see more remote working and distributed organizations? And then a little bit connected to economy, what impact will this have on wages and economy? And there's another question that perhaps relates to young people that I'll come back to later on, but the one on remote working, distributed organizations, what impact will this have on wages and the economy as well?
So I think we have learned an enormous amount in a short period of time, and both as workers, but also as companies. And I can imagine that at least people working for Xynteo sometimes have long commutes, etc. And we have learned that actually we can do a lot of value-added work without that much travel. So I can imagine that there will be a shift or an adjustment towards yes, you go to the office, but also you do more remote work. I also believe that companies very quickly will figure out that there are new competitive models, not only when it comes to how you set up your workforce globally, but there is also like a lot of opportunity in tapping into lower cost, very high quality workforces around Europe. Or for that matter, inside the European countries. So my view on this is that I personally believe all our learning will be very beneficial, both for the workers, for the companies, and not least for the environment.
Yeah, I think so. And I think Dr. Chris referenced leaders who have had lots of experience from the past, but learning from kind of new leaders, and also the ability to coach and teach. But I think the point you're making is actually the ability to tap into talent that maybe wouldn't have been accessible because of proximity of having to travel to a defined destination of work, that may get completely opened up as a result of this change and this sort of hybrid model, invoking and growing the next level of new leaders for the economy. So I'm going to maybe, Oswald, you talked on the topic of competitiveness, and that is a beautiful segue to our next topic of, what does competitiveness mean, and actually how will we evolve either as a country, globally, as a larger business, as a smaller business. And so I'll come to you, Dr. Chris, because I know this is an area that you've spent a lot of time looking at, really what cuts through and what makes some organizations more competitive than others. And I think we've seen a lot of those patterns pre the crisis. But what do you think that's going to mean as we come out of it? So where are you seeing the greatest advances in competitiveness? And then obviously a topic near and dear to my heart, like how is technology helping with that competitive position?
Yeah, I think it's really important to kind of think about what's been happening going into the crisis and then where we're situated now relative to competitiveness. So, in our studies over the past couple of years, we've been exploring what makes these highly competitive advanced organizations that are outperforming in their sectors. What are the traits and characteristics of these organizations? What are they doing differently that potentially contributing to their competitive success? And we found that in those advanced organizations, in 2018, they were outperforming in the sector when they were investing heavily in their technology and their people alongside it to create a kind of augmented workforce that was getting the most out of its people and its technology. They were outperforming those who weren't making the same levels of investments in their people and their technology by about 5% on performance indicators, business outcomes, financial productivity. By 2019, that gap had already widened to 11.5%. And we were starting to see a significant rift between organizations that were advancing down a process of participating meaningfully in the digital economy and those that weren't. And it was defined by performance issues, which were related to technology, which was essentially organizations that were able to redesign themselves around the technology rather than trying to simply replace one function in the business with another. So not seeking just a bottom line cost cutting or efficiency gain, but rather designing the technology into their operating models and the way that they develop their business models and engage with their customers. Those organizations were very successful with this kind of critical path to putting technology at the heart of what they do and redesigning the organizational structure around that, particularly smart technology. So data lakes, data pipelines, algorithms, the ability to move from experimentation to scaling quite swiftly, infrastructure investments in cloud and AI, technologies to scale. Those organizations are succeeding in that regard. And on the flip side, we saw a purpose-led agenda that was also contributing greatly to their success. And that was a values-led pursuit of value, ability to identify and address bias in organizations and thereby operationalize ethics rather than just develop ethical strategies, a culture of sharing and collaboration within the organization, continuous learning and investment in continuous learning throughout skill development in the organization, and an advanced diversity and inclusivity program that made an effort significantly to draw the inclusive nature of the business together and to avoid repeating those biases that may have been predominant in the past in hiring practices and the way they develop their teams. So it's a very powerful mix of technological advancement and social and investment in your people that brings the most competitive businesses to bear. And I think now through the crisis, that's more important than ever.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because you listen to the kind of the key ingredients that came out in some of the research that you did. It's definitely not like only technology that makes a difference. It's not only leadership that makes a difference. It's not only culture. It's not only skills. It's the power of integrating all of them together so that you create a kind of trusted environment, but you're using technology to kind of differentiate and empower that then shapes a workplace of trust and innovation and taking risks, etc. But I think as from a leadership perspective, it's hard to always get that balance right. You then throw in the mix of coronavirus. It definitely puts challenges into how leaders think about this. But some really good thoughts there, Dr. Chris. And I look forward to continuing to sort of monitor what that means for competitiveness together with you as we go through this. So, Osvald, you've obviously worked closely, and you've seen businesses respond and evolve in this climate. I know you have a big passion for kind of partnerships, relationships, and how that unlocks opportunity. So do you want to share some of your thoughts on the role of partnerships and relationships, and how you believe this to be important for opportunity for leaders going forward?
Thank you. First of all, following Dr. Chris's reasoning now around imagination, innovation, and the chemistry of all these elements, what I see in many of the companies we work with is, as the context is changing and shifting dramatically and very fast, the question is, how do you really interpret the situation and respond properly? So maybe in the past you would have one CEO or like an executive trying to interpret the ongoing changes. No, you basically would like to have a culture, like a team of chief context officers, people who truly try to understand the breadth of what's going on. And then we see this is transforming into new actions very, very fast in some of the companies we are working with. For example, their own supply chains. We have an era behind us with global supply chains. There is suddenly we realize that there's a lot of risk associated with global supply chains only. So how do you complement those with local supply chains to make sure that you can keep factories and also keep jobs going when the going gets tough?
Yeah, I think we've seen a lot of examples of that as well, haven't we, in this crisis?
Clare, we see that. And just one or two more comments on partnerships. You see, what we are really up against now is not only to optimize the old models, but is to transform the systems, is to transform the transportation system, the food system, the energy system, etc. And that requires unprecedented collaboration in ways that we haven't seen before. And this brings me to the final point, maybe, on competitiveness. And that brings me back to leadership again. Because what you need in this new situation, you need a leadership bench with future fit skills. And those skills are, one, contextual acuity, the capacity to build trust across businesses, collaboration, and also the capacity to build confidence and move forward under great uncertainty. So these are some of the new things that we see great leaders represent. And there's much more to be said here. But
I know, I was going to say, like, the double click on what inspires confidence in times of crisis could be a talk in its own right, actually. So there's been some other questions that have come through, and I'll maybe try to touch on some of these now. So I'll come back to you, Osvald, on thinking about the UK on a global stage. What do you believe the opportunity is for global competitiveness? And how should companies think about things like international trade, connectivity with the rest of the world? I mean, clearly that's important for governments and a key topic right now. But I think a major topic for either larger organizations or for kind of entrepreneurs thinking about how they're growing their business internationally. So I'd love your views there.
After having lived in the UK for a long time, I have enjoyed the open, competitive economy of the United Kingdom. In the end, when it comes to international competitiveness, the question is, how quickly do you learn? How quickly do you build teams which are internationally competitive? And I think out of the 200 largest companies in Europe, a very large portion of them are still headquartered in the UK. So I think there is a lot to play for. I personally see that Brexit was a temporary mistake and a detour on our way to deeper collaboration in Europe and the world. The strength that we see in the UK is that it's a home for global companies. They like to be in the UK. Microsoft is one, MasterCard is another, Verizon is the third, and there's an incredible talent pool. So with that, coming back to Dr. Chris's reasoning a little bit earlier here, the chemistry, the capacity of this bundle of energy and creativity in London will not go away. And that should make us very hopeful for long-term competitiveness for a long time to come.
Yeah, well, we hope, both on behalf of myself and I'm sure all the people on watching in, we hope that your predictions are right there. So, I mean, I think if we think of the, I'll try and weave the other couple of questions that we've had as we go through to the next topic, which is, the final topic that we have teeing up for now, which is about creating the future. And with the link on of CogX of getting the next 10 years right, and maybe come back again to you, Osvald, like, what do you believe the responsibility of both commercial and public sector organizations have to ensure individuals are both developed? And then what do you see as some of the broader societal benefits of that? I mean, I think we're seeing huge unrest in some cases, challenges as we see rise in unemployment, changing skill profile, impact of technology innovation. And I think this is going to be a very, very important topic for us to get the future right. And I'd love to hear your views on that question.
Yes. First of all, I think the solution to this is not one silver bullet or some key decisions. This requires a broad, deep, collaborative efforts with government, business, and workers. When it comes to the question of responsibility, who is responsible for what? I think individuals are responsible for trying to educate themselves and be skilled, etc. Companies are, it's in their interest to reskill and build up the skill pool in their company and in the country. And that's for sure also the interest of the government.
Yeah,
so, So I believe that we come from a long tradition of having different interest groups in the society, to some extent fighting against each other, and there was this fight around who's in charge of what and distribution of wealth. I think we are now in a situation where the question is simply, how can we learn faster? How can we come together and produce legislative frameworks, invest and build skills that are fit for the future from a very high cost base that we have in Western Europe?
Yeah, and I do think it will be a challenging mixture, I guess, to kind of navigate as we go through that. I mean, Osvald talked a lot, Dr. Chris, around skills. So how would you encourage leaders to think about training, reskilling, development of their employees, and how do we think about that from an inclusion point of view, so that we don't leave people behind and we take this crisis and change in technology just to be a way that we make the next revolution one that really is inclusive of people going forward?
Yeah, I think that it's a really good point that, this is now a discussion which is broader as we're looking at things and trying to understand factors where we can see that, institutional racism can exist in the practices and the ways in which things are rolled out, and inclusivity can be limited by the very nature of the way that things have traditionally been conducted. And it's not to suggest that the way we've made an effort to reskill or upskill, but there's obvious, evidence now emerging within society that, particular forms of work are overrepresented by particular populations within communities, within society, and that there's bias inherent in the way in which we've made an effort to try to bring everybody along in an upskilling, reskilling for the digital economy kind of a process, and it tends to skew towards certain populations that we're coming from a position of strength to begin with, and the old argument was always, well, we can't reskill the bus driver to become a data scientist or something along those kinds of lines, which sort of look to what are we going to do with this broad swath of workforce that maybe isn't able to perform these technical roles, which are part of this digital revolution and so on. So really important to understand on skills is that, we are now looking at a world where, there was literacies, which were our basic competencies that every human being has to some level: curiosity, creativity, problem solving and critical thinking, communication skills. These are kind of a basic literacy required to participate. And then there's very high-end technical skills, engineering skills, skills that are related to the underlying code and premises upon which infrastructure is developed and the digital economy functions. And we've been trying to make the leap from this kind of broad base, what it takes to participate, to what it takes to create or to be meaningful contributions. And what we're seeing now is that there's an enormous territory in the middle. It's often called now like no code or low code. It's a form of more sophisticated literacies that are emerging, but also a coming down of those technical capacities and capabilities to be more accessible and more diffused within workforces. And so reskilling and upskilling efforts are now focused not so much on trying to train everybody up to be a data scientist, but rather what it takes to function. I had a very simple example recently. I was working with a student, predicting, classifying clouds. That used to be an enormously technical endeavor. You'd want to know, is it a neural network, decision trees? What's the algorithm? How do we do the model interpretation and fit and so on? And my student was able to learn how to do that using readily available systems and services in about a half an hour. And through that was able to quickly design, a system to decide which holiday home to pitch into to an ad recommender and how clustering and coding would work in relation to that. And it was remarkable how quickly that can be taught and how quickly people can take on those competencies, which then makes them able to apply that in marketing and in sales and any number of business functions and organizations. So I think, what will ensure that people don't get left behind is that we focus on continuous learning and accessibility of these technologies, but we also move away from the suggestion that it's somehow going to be impossible for big swaths of the current workforce to participate in the future of the digital economy. It's shaping up very differently from that.
Yeah, and I think it's the connection between the two. Typically, it would have been you're either very technical or you take this broad-based approach to the roles that you do. I mean, we had a really interesting example, similar one, Chris, like one of the, in work that we've done together with Microsoft with Autoglass as an example, one of the field engineers there, he was typically a field engineer going out to do work, fix window screens, etc. And I think he, using very low code, using some of the basic sort of applications in Dynamics, developed an application just to help the field service engineers for how to do that more effectively and how to report the problems that they saw to make their work more effective. And actually, as a result of that, he saw a transformation from his job as a field engineer to moving into technology. And that probably wouldn't have been possible for someone like him. And it was a wonderful story around, he just didn't believe that a role in technology would ever be possible for him. And I think it's some of those golden threads between making things more accessible to people that can inspire people to learn new skills and somehow democratize professions to open up new opportunities for people that I think is going to be important moving forward. And maybe a question, I think I'll come back to you, Dr. Chris, on this one, but maybe Oswald, you can also comment. We've had a question on what will happen to those young people who don't see higher education as an option as a result of this crisis. And as an academic, Dr. Chris, I'll start with you first, but I would love to hear, Oswald, your view on this too.
Well, just briefly, we're seeing a kind of decoupling broadly of the continuous learning is of utmost importance for everybody in any occupation in the world. And it used to be that was limited to higher education facilities. Universities will continue to play a crucial role in advancing education and providing a platform from which people can learn. But there are countless other access points now and opportunities that are rapidly emerging, particularly in developing economies at unprecedented scale, which are making available knowledge that was previously only accessible to the elites or those with the resources to be able to study in these institutionalized environments. It's a very exciting development, and one that we, even those at the universities who are then having to give up our control over what used to be this fiefdom of education or higher education that we we owned and had an opportunity to provide. This is super exciting for us. We get students arriving at our programs who have already studied 5 or 6 different short courses online on the topics that they're going to be exploring, are rapidly advancing their education alongside that, and often at free or very low cost, they're able to train and develop themselves.
Must keep you on your feet when that happens.
Just Claire, just 2 comments on that note. What I do believe we see many places is also flexible studying, where like what Dr. Chris said, that people are like taking responsibility for themselves and studying things which is relevant for them at that specific time or in that specific location. I also spoke with the other day with Peter Voser, the chairman of ABB, who told me about the revival of the old apprentices programs in Germany and in Switzerland. And there's an enormous interest for those kind of practical studies for many, many students, and industry and society take it very seriously. So that's also like a trend coming back.
Yeah, very much so. And I mean, I think Microsoft has been an active supporter and contributor to the apprentice program for how to get technical skills or skills to provide technical jobs in the UK. And we've seen huge take up amongst that in our customers and partners. And actually that's proving very valuable in terms of next generation of skills for our business as well. So a big proponent of that. But I think that, again, that's going to have to keep pace with what's changing. And I think there's just such an opportunity for employers and for young people to that question. Maybe before I go to the final question, I think if there's any other questions coming through, please post them. But in the remaining 5 minutes, there's a question around what is the workplace of the future for? What purpose does it serve moving forward if large quantities of time consuming work can be done from home? Maybe Oswald, you'd like to comment on that. You know, I think there's a challenge here that says, what is this word workplace and what does that mean?
It's certainly a big question, and I think it has become much more relevant only in the last 90 days. And I also think this comes down to personal preferences. I'm working in countries, and I asked the executive there in India some time ago during the monsoon. I said, why are there so many people here in the office on a Sunday? We happen to meet on a Sunday. And his answer was basically, well, it's much better quality of life to be in the office than being at home at this time of the monsoon. So the world is a very big place, and I think there are many different answers to this great question. I would like to say that one thing is the work, but we can go back to Heinrich Böll and Fließband, etc., who talked about the camaraderie and the opportunity to be together with others and learn together. I think that is something that can take place, of course, many places, but that's an essential part of what we see in Xynteo, is this rich communication between resourceful people trying to solve big problems. That's a wonderful process to be part of. And some of this can be distributed, but I also do believe that the human connection will be important going forward.
Yeah, and actually that importance of, I mean, Chris, I think in one of the early points on leadership talked about culture and kind of creating the right environment. And although, you know, probably to start with the novelty of working from home, but I think people are really missing that sense of collaboration and connection, and technology plays a role like we're doing today of bringing all of that together. But actually this sort of combination of when you bring people together for moments to get that spark of creativity and create a sense of purpose as a team, I think is going to be really important. Right, we've got one final question, and then I'm going to come to my last point, and we've got about 2.5 minutes to do it. So keep your questions, your answers sharp on these ones, please. So question is how people should prepare themselves to deal with unemployment caused by technological innovation. Chris, I have to come to you on that topic, given that this is a specialty of yours. So comments, please.
Yeah, I think that is a sweet spot, and I think that's something that people are recognizing. But as I mentioned, I think that our version of what it means that technological innovation is going to replace human labor, the realities on the ground in the most successful organizations is much more of a hybrid approach. They're getting the most out of their people, which means freeing people up for higher order thinking and critical thinking tasks, but also some of these low code, no code digital applications where they're harnessing the power of enormous computing power and data lakes and so on at their disposal to develop programs and ideas and so on. So I think, in the short term here, that threat is actually receding from where it was a couple of years ago when people were just using technology to cut costs and achieve the bottom line. I think we're seeing that trajectory turn, and I think most organizations will recognize that they need to get the most out of their people alongside their technology, and as a result of that, there's not going to be a displacement of labor, as there hasn't been in any major technological revolution over the past 250 years. That will be marked. We're going to see a much more gradual transition around this. And 50 years from now, we'll see people working in completely different ways that is, I think, more profoundly human than it is technological. And our systems and technologies will be doing amazing things.
We have all the talent we need to solve all our problems and recover better. And that's what we should come together around and truly work collaboratively to advance a way forward where we, one, develop economic growth that works in harmony with the physical environment, two, that leads to a social fabric, social justice in society, and three, that stands the test of time. It works over the long haul. That's what excites me, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be with you, Clare, and Dr. Chris, and this wonderful conference. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Oswald and Dr. Chris, for your for many wise words to think about. I think as we think about both the economy and the future of work, hopefully you've got a sense today of the importance of leadership and leadership decisions, how culture and innovation and providing a culture of risk-taking is going to make organizations more competitive. And that combination of really thinking hard about skills is going to be what creates the future over the next 10 years. And I think the decisions we make in the short term will really start to cast the path ahead. Personally speaking, I think some of the questions that I've been asked around skills and what we do to really connect people into new jobs, opportunities, and the skilling that organizations provide them is going to take partnership. It's going to take partnership collectively with organizations. It's going to take partnership with government. And I think, the road ahead has got optimism in it, but it needs organizations to commit to skilling for some of the, some of the parts of society that will be impacted by some of the crisis. That I think will create opportunity moving forward. So it's been wonderful to have the opportunity to speak. I hope you make the most of other speakers this week at CogX, and I wish you all the best as leaders in the times to come. Thank you.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.